I signed the lease for our new apartment on a Tuesday. By the time Wednesday morning came around, my wife had vanished. She had emptied most of the money from our shared bank account and left only 3 things behind: an empty suitcase, divorce papers already signed with her name at the bottom, and her 20-year-old disabled sister sitting silently on the couch, staring into space. There was no phone call, no message, no explanation. Just a small note lying on the kitchen counter, written in her familiar handwriting. "Take care of Sophie, I can't." That moment happened 7 years ago. And just last month, when I stepped into a room Lillian never imagined I would enter, she saw me, and her face turned pale when she noticed who was standing directly behind me. But before I explain what happened that day, 7 years later, I need to start from the beginning. Back when I was still the man who believed he understood exactly how his life would unfold. Back then I was 31 years old. My name is Nathan Cole, and I worked as a mechanical engineer for a mid-sized company in Columbus, Ohio. My life was simple and steady. I earned a respectable salary, showed up to work every day, and made sure my bills were paid on time. I wasn't the kind of person who chased big ambitions or dramatic adventures. What I wanted was something far more ordinary, a life that felt stable and reasonable. For a time, my marriage to Lillian Hart seemed to provide exactly that. Lillian had a kind of intelligence that filled a room the moment she walked into it. She spoke with confidence and clarity, and within minutes people tended to agree with her, even those who had held the opposite opinion not long before. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and moved quickly up the ladder. She dressed sharply, carried herself with purpose, and always seemed to have a plan for what came next. When we first got married, I believed I had chosen someone who would never allow our life to fall apart. Lillian was too organized, too determined for chaos to take hold. I respected that about her. And if I'm being completely honest, there was a small part of me that feared it as well. Not fear of her exactly, but fear of what it might feel like to end up on the wrong side of a mind that's sharp. Then there was Sophie. Sophie was Lillian's younger sister. She was 20 when everything in our lives fell apart. From birth, she had lived with a medical condition that required her to use a wheelchair and rely on others for many everyday tasks, things most people rarely think about, like getting dressed, bathing, or moving from her bed into her chair. Their parents had died in a car accident when Sophie was 16. After that, Lillian became her legal guardian, so when Lillian and I got married, Sophie was already part of the picture. She moved into the extra bedroom of our apartment. Sophie had a way of blending into the background. She was quiet, almost invisible at times, like another piece of furniture in the room. She rarely spoke unless someone addressed her first, and even then her replies were brief and careful, as if she were constantly measuring how much space she was allowed to occupy. She never complained. She never asked for anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. Whenever people discussed her situation, she would lower her gaze to her lap, avoiding eye contact. In her wheelchair, she seemed to shrink slightly, like someone hopping to fade from the scene before anyone noticed the inconvenience her presence might cause. I want to make something clear: I did care about Sophie. When Lillian was working late, I helped Sophie move from her chair to the bed. I drove her to therapy sessions across town. If she mentioned a book she wanted to read, I would pick it up for her the next time I was at the store. But deep down, I always believed something simple: Sophie was Lillian's responsibility, not mine. After all, I had married Lillian, not her sister. In my mind, there was an unspoken agreement. If anything ever happened between Lillian and me, Sophie's care would return to the family it belonged to. That was the quiet arrangement I carried in my head. Lillian never knew about it. But somehow I think Sophie did. The morning after I signed the lease for our new apartment, I woke up to an uneasy silence. The bed beside me was cold, untouched. Lillian's side looked exactly the way it had the night before, as if no one had slept there at all. At first I assumed she had gotten up early for work, but when I walked to the closet something felt wrong. The door was open and half of her clothes were gone. Shoes that usually lined the bottom shelf were missing. The bathroom looked the same. Her toothbrush, makeup bag and toiletries had disappeared. That's when the knot in my stomach tightened. I found the divorce papers on the kitchen table. They were already signed on her side. Sitting on top was a small yellow note written in her handwriting. It said only 5 words. "Take care of Sophie, I can't." There was nothing else. No explanation, No apology, no forwarding address, not even a date, just a short message that sounded less like a conversation and more like an instruction. I called her phone immediately, then again and again. 14 times before noon. Every call went straight to voicemail. I sent messages too, first confused ones, then angry ones, then shorter texts that simply said, "Call me." None of them received a response. When I contacted her office, the receptionist told me something that made the situation feel even more unreal. Lillian had already submitted her resignation 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks, While I had been comparing apartment layouts and talking about where we might put the cooch, she had already been preparing to leave. Desperate for answers, I drove to her best friend Monica's apartment. When Monica opened the door, I could tell immediately that she knew what had happened. Her expression said it before she spoke. She told me Lillian had asked her not to reveal anything. She said she was sorry, and then she quietly closed the door. By noon that day, I logged into our joint bank account. That's when I discovered the rest of the plan. Over the past month, Lillian had been transferring money out in small amounts, $300 here, $500 there. Each withdrawal was small enough that it never caught my attention. But together, they added up to almost everything we had. The balance left in the account wouldn't even cover 2 months of rent for the apartment whose lease I had just signed. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers, while Sophie remained in the living room behind me. And slowly, the full picture began to form. Lillian hadn't simply walked away from our marriage. She had designed her exit carefully. Every detail had been arranged in advance: the lease, the money transfers, the resignation from her job, so that by the time I woke up that morning, every possible path back to her had already been closed. And she had left Sophie behind like something that no longer fit into the life she was starting. Because she knew something about me. She knew I wouldn't easily abandon a 20-year-old woman who had nowhere else to go. Sophie didn't ask me what had happened that morning. She stayed in the living room, sitting in her wheelchair with her hands resting quietly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. I'm pretty sure she had heard me making those calls earlier. She must have noticed the strain in my voice as it grew sharper with each unanswered attempt. When I finally walked in and sat down on the couch across from her, she looked at me with an expression I've never forgotten. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't even sadness. It was recognition. The kind of look someone has when they've seen a situation like this before and already know how it ends. Sophie had been abandoned once already by the people who were supposed to protect her. She understood exactly what it looked like. For the next 3 days, I barely slept. The divorce papers remained on the kitchen table the entire time, like some kind of device I hadn't decided whether to defuse or trigger. I went to work during the day, came home in the evening, cooked dinner for 2 people, and sat across from Sophie as we ate in silence. And not once did she ask the question that hung in the air between us. She never asked what I planned to do with her. Sophie didn't beg to stay. She didn't cry. She didn't try to prove that she could be useful. She simply continued existing in the apartment exactly as she always had, quietly, carefully, as if taking up as little space as possible. It was the behavior of someone who had learned long ago that the less trouble you cause, the less likely someone is to send you away. On the 4th evening, I met my coworker Greg for a drink after work. At some point during our conversation, he asked the question everyone else was probably thinking. "What are you going to do?" I told him the truth, I didn't know. Greg mentioned several options. There were state programs, assisted living facilities, group homes designed for people who needed daily support. He reminded me gently that I was Sophie's father or her brother. Legally, I had no obligation to keep caring for her. He wasn't wrong. If I had called social services, explained the situation, signed a few forms and stepped away, no one would have blamed me. In fact, some people might have said it was the sensible decision. But that night, when I came home and opened the front door, I found Sophie sitting in the hallway near the entrance. Not in the living room where she usually stayed. Right by the door. As if she had been waiting there just to see whether I would return at all. She looked up when I walked in. And in her eyes, I saw the thing that made the decision for me. It wasn't hope. It wasn't gratitude. It was fear. Not the kind of fear that appears suddenly in a moment of danger, but the kind that settles deep inside someone who already knows what abandonment feels like. The kind that comes from surviving it once and realizing you might not survive it again. She didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. I closed the door behind me, set my keys on the counter, and sat down on the floor next to her wheelchair. I didn't give her a speech. I didn't make promises about the future. I just said one simple thing. I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. She turned her face away from me. For a brief moment her shoulders trembled once, just once, before she became still again. That was the moment everything changed. The moment I chose a life I had never planned for, alongside someone who wasn't technically my responsibility, but who had no one else willing to try. Deciding to keep Sophie was the easy part. Everything that followed was much harder. Choosing to stay and take care of Sophie felt simple in that moment. Living with the consequences of that choice was something else entirely. The first lesson came quickly. Good intentions don't help much when you're sitting in a government office filling out paperwork. Within a week of Lillian's disappearance, I found myself in a county building trying to explain our situation to a caseworker named Denise. I was asking for temporary guardianship of a 20-year-old woman I wasn't related to by blood. Denise looked at me over the top of her glasses with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. It was the kind of look that suggested she was still deciding whether I was doing something noble or something suspicious. To be fair, I wasn't sure which one it looked like from the outside either. She explained that the process wouldn't be quick. There would be background checks, home inspections, and several layers of paperwork before anything could be approved. Until then, Sophie's situation existed in a strange legal grey area. I was caring for her every day, but technically I had no authority to make medical decisions on her behalf. That was only the beginning of the problems. Money became the next reality check. After Lillian emptied our joint account, I was left with about $1,800. At the same time, I had just signed a lease for an apartment that wasn't even designed for someone using a wheelchair. The hallways were too narrow. The bathroom had no support bars. The entrance had 3 steps and no ramp. Later, I realized something that made the situation feel even worse. Lillian had been the one who chose that apartment. She had toured it alone while I was at work, told me it was perfect, and handled most of the paperwork. At the time I had thought she was simply being efficient. Only later did it occur to me that she had deliberately selected a place Sophie couldn't realistically live in, because she had already decided Sophie wouldn't be part of her future. For the first month, I carried Sophie up and down those steps every single day. Once in the morning so we could get to her therapy appointments. Once again in the evening when we returned home. Sophie weighed less than 100 pounds, but lifting someone like that repeatedly takes a toll. By the second week my back ached constantly, and I was surviving on barely 4 hours of sleep each night. Moving wasn't an option, I couldn't afford it. But staying there wasn't easy either. In many ways, I felt trapped in a situation that had been carefully arranged long before I realized what was happening. And then there was Sophie's schedule. Her physical therapy sessions happened 3 times a week. She also had occupational therapy twice weekly, along with a specialist appointment across town once a month. Each visit required a copay that stretched my budget to its limit, and the appointments were only part of the expense. There were replacement cushions for her wheelchair, new leg braces, special adaptive utensils that allowed her to eat independently. Insurance helped cover some of it, but the gaps between what was covered and what was necessary were wide. To keep up with the costs, I began taking freelance drafting jobs at night. After Sophie went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, designing machine parts for companies I would probably never see in person. Most nights I worked until 2 in the morning. More than once, I woke up with my head resting on the keyboard. The physical exhaustion was one thing. The reactions from people around me were another. Neighbors whispered when they saw me carrying Sophie up the steps. Co-workers asked cautious questions about the situation. My mother called from Florida and said gently, "Nathan, sweetheart, you're not responsible for that girl." She said it as if Sophie were some kind of stray animal I had taken home from a parking lot. Greg stopped mentioning group homes, but I could still feel the thought lingering whenever we spoke. Strangers were sometimes the worst. At the pharmacy, a cashier once saw me pushing Sophie's wheelchair and asked if she was my daughter. At a hardware store, a man watched me loading a portable ramp into my truck and joked that my wife must make me handle all the heavy lifting. I never corrected them. I simply paid for what I needed and left. Through all of this, Sophie remained almost completely silent. She followed whatever routine I set without complaint. She got up when I said it was time. She ate whatever I cooked. She attended every appointment without protest. But the quiet wasn't cooperation. It was something heavier than that. It was the silence of someone who believed she was the reason another person's life had become so difficult, and who had decided the best thing she could do was disappear into the background so she wouldn't make things worse. One night I walked into the kitchen and found her staring at the divorce papers I had left on the counter. She wasn't reading them. She was simply looking at them. Her expression was completely blank. When she noticed me watching, she quietly turned her wheelchair and went back to her room without saying a word. After that, I moved the papers into a drawer. But I couldn't move the feeling that had put that expression on her face. It took me nearly a full year to understand the extent of what Lillian had actually done before she left. The first hint appeared in the mail one afternoon. An envelope had been forwarded from our previous address. Inside was a bank statement for a savings account I had never seen before. The account belonged solely to Lillian. According to the records, it had been opened about 14 months before the morning she disappeared. What caught my attention immediately were the deposits. The amounts matched the small transfers that had been quietly disappearing from our joint account over the same period of time. That meant something important. Lillian hadn't started moving money when she decided to leave. She had begun more than a year earlier. This wasn't the action of someone who had suddenly broken under stress. It was the work of someone patiently constructing a way out, step by step, while continuing to sit across the dinner table from me every evening as if nothing was wrong. The second clue arrived through Monica. After months of avoiding my calls, Lillian's best friend finally picked up one evening. I don't think she did it out of guilt. More likely, she was simply tired of ignoring me. What she told me made my stomach tighten. According to Monica, Lillian had explained her disappearance to their group of friends in a completely different way. She claimed she had left because I was emotionally distant and unwilling to support her. She told them that caring for Sophie had slowly destroyed her mental health. In her version of events, she had begged me for help and compassion, and in that same version I had refused. She said she had no choice but to walk away in order to protect herself. Monica admitted she didn't think the story was fair to me. That was the reason she had decided to tell me, but she also made it clear that she didn't want to become involved any further. After saying that, she hung up. I never heard from her again. For a long time, I sat with that information. Lillian hadn't only abandoned Sophie and ended our marriage. She had also built a narrative to justify it. In that story, she was the exhausted caretaker who had sacrificed everything until she finally collapsed under the pressure. And I was the cold husband who had forced her hand. It was a neat and convincing story, difficult to challenge. After all, the only two people who had actually witnessed the truth of our marriage were me and a young woman in a wheelchair, someone no one thought to ask for her perspective. That realization led me to another conclusion. The divorce itself hadn't simply been the end of a relationship. It had been a performance. Even the note she left behind, "Take care of Sophie, I can't," suddenly looked different in my mind. It sounded less like a desperate plea and more like the final line of a carefully written script. A sentence meant to make her appear overwhelmed rather than calculating. But while all of this was sinking in, something else was quietly happening in our apartment, something Lillian had never anticipated. Sophie was beginning to change. At first, the change was so small I almost missed it. One afternoon, her physical therapist, Rachel, mentioned that Sophie had started asking questions during their sessions. They weren't dramatic questions, just simple ones. "Can I try doing that stretch myself?" What would happen if I practiced this exercise at home? Rachel told me it was the first time in 2 years of working with Sophie that she had heard her start a conversation about her own care. I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded and drove Sophie home. But the changes didn't stop there. Gradually, they became impossible to ignore. After that first small shift, the changes in Sophie became more noticeable. For months, I had bought adaptive kitchen tools that allowed her to cook more easily, special grips, stabilizing boards, utensils designed for limited mobility. They had sat untouched on the counter for a long time. Then one evening I came home and found the frying pan on the stove. Sophie had taught herself how to make scrambled eggs. At first it was just that. Then she added toast. Later she figured out how to prepare simple sandwiches on her own. None of it was complicated, but every new step meant she needed less help from me. Another small change appeared in the mornings. Every day Sophie began wheeling herself down the driveway to the mailbox. It wasn't far, but it was something she had never done before. Back when Lillian was around, the mail had always been collected for her. Now Sophie handled it herself. One evening I walked into the kitchen after work and saw something that surprised me even more. Sophie was sitting at the table with my laptop open in front of her. Several websites were displayed on the screen. She had been researching online certificate programs. When she noticed me standing there, she hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "I think I want to try graphic design." That sentence stayed with me. During the 4 years I had known Sophie while living with Lillian, she had never once said what she wanted to do with her life. 6 months after Lillian left, she was beginning to discover it. Slowly, I started to understand something I had been too exhausted and angry to recognize before. Sophie didn't need someone who would carry her upstairs forever, argue with insurance companies, and sacrifice everything in silence. What she needed was both simpler and harder to give. She needed someone who believed she actually had a future. Lillian had taken care of Sophie the way people fulfill an obligation, efficiently, responsibly, but with the quiet frustration of someone who never chose the role in the first place. I wasn't perfect, not even close. But I had done one thing differently. I had asked Sophie what she wanted. And it turned out that question was something she had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. By the end of the 3rd year after Lillian's departure, Sophie had grown into someone I barely recognized compared to the quiet, withdrawn girl who first arrived in our apartment. She had completed her online graphic design certificate, earning the skills to take on small freelance jobs. At first it was simple projects, creating logos for local businesses, designing social media layouts for a neighborhood nonprofit, but it was hers, work she chose and built herself. She followed her therapy routines without reminders, practicing exercises each morning with diligence and independence. I had moved us into a first-floor apartment that was wheelchair accessible, with wider doorways and a roll-in shower, making life more practical and safer for her. The guardianship paperwork was finally finalized. Life remained challenging, but it had a rhythm and shape I could recognize. I allowed myself to think that the hardest part, the immediate aftermath of Lillian's disappearance, was behind us. But I was wrong. One day a letter arrived from a lawyer. It was from Lillian. She claimed that she wanted to resume caregiving responsibilities for Sophie, saying her personal circumstances had improved and that she was now fully capable of providing the care Sophie deserved. The letter requested a meeting to discuss the transition. I read it 3 times, each pass leaving me more unsettled. 3 years of silence. No calls, no emails, not even a birthday card. And now she wanted back in after abandoning everything in the middle of the night. I called my lawyer, Donald Pratt, who had helped with Sophie's guardianship. He explained that as Sophie's biological sister and former legal guardian, Lillian had a legitimate claim, especially if she could demonstrate that she was now stable and capable of providing care. Courts tend to favor blood relatives. Donald told me to prepare for a legal battle. When I asked what Lillian's real motivation might be, he paused. Then he said something that stayed with me. In my experience, people don't come back for the person, they come back for the story. I realized immediately what he meant. Lillian had built a narrative of herself as the overwhelmed caregiver, the woman who sacrificed everything, and returning to Sophie would complete that story. It would erase the appearance of abandonment, proving she had always intended to return once she was ready. I couldn't tell Sophie right away. Her life was fragile but flourishing. Her freelance work was growing. She had built a small portfolio she could be proud of, and most importantly, she laughed. Real laughter, the kind that filled a room instead of hiding from it. I feared what news of Lillian's letter would do to her. But Sophie discovered the letter herself. I had left it in my briefcase, and she needed a pen from the front pocket. She read it at the kitchen table while I was at work. When I returned home, she was sitting in the same spot she had waited 3 years earlier, by the front door. But this time her expression wasn't fear. It was something stronger, more mature. She looked at me and said simply, "She doesn't get to do this." Lillian's attempt to regain control escalated faster than I expected. Within a month, she had hired a family lawyer in Columbus and formally petitioned to modify Sophie's guardianship. Her filing painted a portrait of a devoted sister forced to step away temporarily due to mental health challenges, who had since recovered, rebuilt her life, and now wanted to provide Sophie the care and family connection she deserved. But it went further. The petition accused me of isolating Sophie from her biological family and claimed my guardianship had been obtained under questionable circumstances, essentially suggesting I had manipulated the situation. Donald, my lawyer, told me to remain calm, but calm was a distant concept. Lillian had advantages I didn't. A new city, a stable husband named Trent who worked in real estate, financial security, and the polished image of someone capable of providing a better life for Sophie on paper. I, by contrast, was a 35-year-old single man, no blood relation to Sophie, relying on freelance income that fluctuated month to month. The court didn't know about the hidden bank accounts, the calculated disappearance, or the lies Lillian had spread to her friends. To them, it was simply a sister seeking to return. The turning point came when Lillian's lawyer requested a home evaluation. 2 social workers arrived one Wednesday afternoon to assess my apartment, Sophie's living conditions, and her emotional well-being. They were professional, courteous, but their questions carried a subtle sharpness, as if they had been coached. "Do you ever feel restricted here? Do you miss your sister? Have you been encouraged to speak negatively about Lillian?" Sophie answered each question quietly and honestly, but I could see the old fear flicker in her eyes again, the way she dropped her gaze, folded her hands tighter in her lap. She was 24, yet here were 2 strangers asking her to justify the life she had built for herself. That night, after the social workers left, I sat alone in my truck in the driveway, staring at the steering wheel. I had spent 4 years rebuilding something from the wreckage Lillian left behind. Time, money, sleep, career dreams, all poured into creating a stable life for Sophie. And now, with a single legal filing and a polished story, Lillian threatened to undo it all. If she succeeded, Sophie would be returned to a woman who had already proven she could walk away without looking back. And Sophie, who had just started laughing, just started creating, just started living for herself, would once again be reminded that she could be picked up and put down at someone else's convenience. For the first time since Lillian's disappearance, I felt afraid. Afraid that I could lose everything I had fought to build with her. The legal struggle stretched on, dragging us through a 5th year and into the 6th. Depositions, motions, evaluations, and continuances piled up, each one draining money I didn't have and sleep I couldn't afford to lose. Donald kept reminding me to stay focused, to let the legal process play out. But somewhere along the way, I began to lose sight of why I was fighting. At first it had been clear, I was protecting Sophie. By year 6, though, after every filing from Lillian's side landed like a punch, after each allegation painted me as a controlling outsider exploiting a vulnerable young woman, something darker began to creep in. I wanted to win, not just for Sophie. I wanted to win against Lillian. I wanted to stand in a courtroom and watch her carefully constructed story crumble. I wanted her to feel, even a little, what it was like to have someone take everything from her, the way she had taken everything from me. Sophie noticed it before I did. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through folders Donald had sent, bank records, old employment files, a detailed timeline of Lillian's transfers. I was talking to myself about how we could use a particular piece of evidence to prove she had been planning her exit for over a year. Sophie was across the table, working on a freelance design project. She stopped, looked up at me, and said something I couldn't ignore. "Nathan, I need you to hear something." I put the papers down. She continued, "If you go in there trying to destroy her, you are going to use me to do it. And I don't want to be used again. Not by her, not by you." Her words hit me harder than anything Lillian had ever done. She was right. I had been so focused on exposing Lillian that I had forgotten to ask Sophie what she wanted. I had started treating her the same way Lillian had, as a pawn in someone else's story. The only difference was the motive. Lillian used Sophie to justify leaving. I was about to use Sophie to justify my anger. Different reasons, same outcome. Sophie would once again be a character in someone else's narrative instead of the author of her own life. That night I called Donald. I told him we were changing our strategy. No more offensive tactics, no more digging for dirt to use against Lillian. From now on, our approach would be simple. Let Sophie speak for herself and show who she had become. Donald warned me it was risky. Judges respond to evidence, not philosophy. I told him Sophie's life over the past 6 years was the evidence. If that wasn't enough, nothing would be. The guardianship review hearing was finally scheduled for a Tuesday in October, nearly 7 years after Lillian had walked out. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lit, with plain plastic chairs that made everything feel temporary, fragile. Lillian was already there when we arrived, polished and rehearsed. A new coat, carefully applied makeup, her husband Trent seated behind her in the gallery. She looked every bit the woman who had prepared this moment for months. Her lawyer had a thick folder on the table, ready to present the story she had been constructing for nearly a decade. Then Sophie wheeled herself in beside me. The first thing Lillian's eyes found was Sophie, and I saw a flicker of surprise cross her face, perhaps at how different Sophie looked. She was healthier, steadier, with a confidence and posture that hadn't been there before. But Lillian quickly recovered, shifting her gaze to the doorway behind us. That's when her expression changed completely. Rachel Simmons, Sophie's longtime physical therapist, entered, now holding professional credentials in disability advocacy and serving as Sophie's independent care coordinator. Behind her came Janet Keller, a disability rights attorney who had taken Sophie's case pro bono after hearing about the guardianship dispute. And behind them was Patrick D.S., director of the independent living program Sophie had joined 6 months earlier. They weren't there to argue against Lillian, they weren't there to fight for me. They were there for Sophie. In their hands were nearly 7 years of documentation. Therapy records, progress reports, academic transcripts from her graphic design certificate, samples of her freelance work, a financial plan showing her growing independence, and a detailed proposal for supported independent living. Everything was signed and verified by professionals who had watched Sophie transform from a quiet, hesitant girl into a determined, capable woman building her own life. Lillian stared at the 3 people standing behind Sophie, and I watched the realization settle over her like a cold wave. This wasn't what she had prepared for. She had been ready for a fight between 2 adults arguing over control. But Sophie's life was no longer theirs to argue over. Sophie had built it herself, and she had brought the people who helped her do it to prove it. Lillian's lawyer opened his folder and began presenting her case, but the room had already shifted. Every carefully crafted point he made about Lillian's readiness to care for Sophie was quietly countered by a single truth. Sophie didn't need Lillian's care. She didn't need mine either. What Sophie needed had nothing to do with who owned her life. She needed a supportive environment, respect, and the freedom to make her own choices, and she had already found all 3. When the judge asked Sophie if she wanted to speak, she said yes. She wheeled herself to the front of the courtroom. There were no notes, no glances toward me, no appeals to Lillian. She spoke clearly and confidently, her voice calm but firm. She thanked me for staying when I had every reason to leave, acknowledging the stability I had provided while Lillian was gone. She recognized that her sister had faced her own struggles and made it clear that she did not wish to condemn her. And then she said something that made the courtroom silent. "I am not a burden someone carries. I am not a prop for someone else's story. I have my own story. I am asking this court to let me live it." The judge granted Sophie the right to continue living under her current independent plan. Lillian's petition to modify the guardianship was denied. After the hearing, Lillian stood outside the courthouse, her husband already heading toward their car. I didn't approach her, and she didn't approach me. But as Sophie and I walked by, Lillian looked directly at her sister, truly looked at her perhaps for the first time in years. I saw something break in her eyes. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shame. It was the weight of a truth she could no longer avoid. She had walked out, believing Sophie would always be a burden. She thought the only way to survive was to let go. And now Sophie was standing there, steady, capable, independent, and speaking for herself. The carefully constructed lie Lillian had built her entire escape around was dismantled before her eyes, without a single word needing to be said. Lillian left that day. I never followed up. I didn't call, didn't try to get the last word. There was no need. Revenge would have given me nothing I truly wanted. What I wanted was simple: for Sophie to be safe, respected, and able to make decisions about her own life. And now she had all of that. Not because of me, not because of anyone forcing her way, but because someone finally stepped aside and let her lead. Sophie is 27 now. She lives in a supported apartment, just a short drive from her freelance work at Mind Designs, where she creates logos and branding materials for small businesses. Every Sunday evening she calls me. We talk about her projects, her ideas, or sometimes nothing at all. It's a connection built on choice, not obligation. She is not my sister, she is not my daughter, she is not a responsibility I was forced to bear. She is a person I chose to stand beside when no one else would. And in doing so, she taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. The people the world labels as burdens are only burdens if we refuse to see them as human beings with the right to grow, to decide, and to live with dignity. Sophie taught me that lesson, and I will never forget it. Looking back now, I can see how much we both changed over those 7 years. Sophie went from a silent, withdrawn young woman to someone who confidently built her own life. And I went from feeling trapped by circumstances I hadn't chosen to realizing that choosing to care, even when it was hard, could transform both our lives. Every struggle, every sleepless night, every bureaucratic hurdle became part of the path that allowed her to step into her own independence. Lillian's absence, as painful and chaotic as it was, forced me to discover what real responsibility meant, not just following rules or fulfilling obligations, but truly seeing a person, listening to them, and supporting them to be their own person. Sophie's story is no longer written by anyone else. She decides the chapters. She defines her successes and setbacks, and she faces the world on her terms. I didn't rescue her. I simply stayed, and in doing so I allowed her to rise. And in the process, I learned a truth I will carry forever. The ones society labels as burdens are often the ones who teach us the most about compassion, respect, and the power of choice. Sophie's life is hers. She leads it. And she taught me that standing beside someone is sometimes the greatest act of courage and humanity we can offer.